Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Francesca Molinaro. I'm the Director of Corporate Diversity and Inclusion for Chemonics International. For those of you that don't know Chemonics, we are one of the largest partners to the U.S. Agency for International Development, and we're implementing projects all over the world in over 70 countries in pretty much every sector that USAID operates in. I was hired by Chemonics just over a year ago to help stand up their diversity and inclusion initiative. And this is the second time that I've done this for an organization. And what I want to share with you today are not so much lessons learned in terms of what is the secret sauce, because there is no secret sauce. What I want to share with you is a framework. And I have a handout on the table which we're going to be using together, and I left it blank purposefully so that we can fill it in as we go along. And part of this is thinking about your own diversity and inclusion journey for your organization. And just like when you're going somewhere new, you use a map. What I hope you're going to leave with today is your roadmap to help you either jumpstart a diversity inclusion program for your organization or to take your program to the next level. One of the things I'm not going to do here today is talk about the business case for diversity and inclusion, because we should already all know that. And if you need information about that, I'm happy to connect with you afterwards. What I find is that most organizations already are clear. They know that diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do. They know it's the smart thing to do. They just don't know how to do it, especially if they're smaller, especially if they're under-resourced. So I'm going to take you on this journey with me today, and I hope that when you leave, you're going to have some really good insights and ideas that you can take back to your organization. So I want to start with, since it's a fair-sized room, getting to know you, but rather than have everyone introduce themselves, we're going to do this by a show of hands. So how many of you work for a nonprofit? Okay. How many of you work for a for-profit? Okay, so almost equally split. And how many of you work for either government, multilateral, or international organization? A couple of you. Okay. How many of you work in an organization that is 50 people or less? A few of you. 50 to 250 people? 250 to 1,000? And over 1,000. Okay, so we have some like fairly large organizations here in the room. And if you were going to think about where your organization is right now, would you say, and this is in terms of diversity and inclusion, how many of you are complete beginners? You haven't gotten started, or you're just getting started? Okay, a couple of you. How many of you have gotten started? Okay. And how many of you have lots of experience but could still learn? Okay, so it seems like most of you are kind of somewhere in the middle there. I'm very curious. How many of you have diversity and inclusion included as a specific goal in your strategic plan for your organization? Okay. How many of you have a dedicated D&I leader or diversity inclusion function in your organization? Okay. How many of you have a budget for diversity and inclusion? Yeah, that's the reaction. Okay. And then last question, with regards to this, how many of you have a diversity council? So some kind of structure, or employee resource groups? Okay. And then my last question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, right? With 1 being like not at all, and 5 being all the way. You can show this with your hands, right? You can raise your number. How well do you say you're doing overall on diversity and inclusion in your organization? I see some 2s, I see some 1s, a couple of 3s. You're a 10, awesome.
We have diversity in our name.
Where do you work? Oh, Coach Diversity, okay. Awesome. I know Tawana.
Yeah. We're chatting here, I think. And Justice?
So besides Coach Diversity, who's knocked it out of the park, we all have something to learn here. This was really helpful for me to kind of gauge where we are in the room. So I love this cartoon because these 2 gentlemen are saying, we thought we put in the detail later. And the devil's really in the detail, right? It's like, we know we want to go there, but how do we get there? And that's what I'm going to work with you on today. So each of you should have a blank roadmap. I'm going to, on the table, if you need more, there's some more up here at the front. And we're going to start working this together to fill it out. And this is a tool I developed when I was doing my own consulting. And I found this really useful to help organizations think through where they need to go with their D&I program or plan. And I want you can think about this, given the real spread we have in terms of size of organizations and also the maturity in terms of our diversity journey. You can think about this on the scale that's most appropriate for your organization. And that's always my starting point. So again, you know, people always ask me, so like, the number one question when I was doing consulting, so I want to do unconscious bias training. Do you do unconscious bias training? And my next question would be like, well, sure. Why do you want unconscious bias training? Well, shouldn't I have it? Isn't everyone else doing it? And here's what I'm here to say to you today. It does not matter what everybody else is doing. You need to reflect on your business model. You need to reflect on the culture of your organization, and you need to find the opportunity that makes sense for you. Okay, so this can be the scale that's appropriate for your organization. But we're all going to start at the same place, and that is with your vision. What is your why? So I want you to take a minute to think about if in 2-3 years from now, you are successful, what is different from today? And again, I can't stress enough that everyone's version of success is going to look different, and that's perfectly okay. And I also want to stress that this is really important. Because if you don't know why it won't work, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know how to get there? Okay? So what's your vision? The next piece of that is connected to the vision, which is your specific goals. What is it that you actually want to achieve? And what are you going to prioritize? Now, there's some of you that I saw that are in really small organizations, and almost everybody here said they don't have a budget for this. So that's when focus and prioritization becomes very, very critical. Because you can't be everything to everybody, so where are you going to invest your energies? So even if it's one goal, my advice is choose one thing and be relentless about it. I'm going to give a little more time. First of all, are there any questions so far? Yes, Alamelu.
Is this something that you do as a management team? Who are the people who are involved in doing this?
I didn't. That's a great question. Ideally, this should be an inclusive process, right? You should be collaborating. That's not always the case, right? Sometimes there's someone that just has to start this and be the leader, and then they validate this. But ideally, you want to get your key stakeholders engaged around this. But I think that this is a really good process to start thinking through the different elements. If you have a diversity council, it could be with your executive leadership team. You know, again, every organization is different, so look for where that opportunity is. But of course, I would have to advocate for an inclusive approach because you don't want to define inclusion by one person's perspective. And I forgot to mention this too. We're going to go through this, probably take 15, 20 minutes to do that, but then I'm going to turn the tables on you and ask for some brave volunteers to maybe share some of their insights. So I wanted to just put that out there to give people some time to marinate with that. That was a really great question because it goes to my next point, the stakeholders. For whom are you doing this? Who are you creating value for? And what do they need? And if you don't know, you should ask them. So we did not plant this question at all. All right, and so one of the ways I suggest that you can get this information, or a couple of the ways you can get this information, is figure out what data you already have, right? Like, do you already do a staff engagement survey? Or do you have some other touch points with your staff so you already know what they care about? What do your leaders care about? You know, and you can also do focus groups. That's a great way to get some of this information and validate. But understand who your audience is for this. And I always say engage people around what they really care about, because that's easier to build your army around this. I'm jumping around. I skipped a box, but that was purposeful. Internal alignment. So this says, what other internal systems, processes, or strategies do you need to consider? I think, in my experience working in this space, where I see companies struggle is in a couple of places. One is, what are you doing? I want some of that. You know, I just want to implement whatever you're doing and put it into my organization without taking into account what is that structure, why does your organization exist, what other internal systems and processes. And you really need to think of diversity and inclusion as you would any other business strategy. So if you were going to put a marketing strategy into place, you'd consider, why does your organization exist? How do we get things done in this organization? How are people held accountable? How is success measured? I heard that in one of the sessions, and I can't remember which one, but it was, what does success look like in your organization? So you need to have internal alignment with your other systems and processes. I also think this is really, really critical for smaller organizations. I'm going to get to this point when I talk about partners, but you really can't do this work alone. And I was, up until last week, a team of one. I was a team of one for a long time in my other organization. So you need to work through other people. So understanding how things get done in your organization is really critical. Treat this like you would any other change management initiative. And that goes to my next point, partners. Who is going to support you internally and who is going to support you externally? This is really important because, one, if you are alone, you will burn out. So you need to understand how you could get your work done through other people, especially if you don't have a budget, right? How do you leverage some of the work you're already doing? So is it human resources? Is it a business leader who really cares about this as part of their business? Can you hook into things that are already happening in the organization? Kind of goes back to one of the things I said about focus. Are you already doing some type of training that this makes sense to integrate into? So you're building in a component rather than building a whole standalone product. And I like to call this amplification, right? How can you amplify? And these 4 boxes here that we're going to look at right now, these are really like taking that systemic whole organization view. I'm going to stop again and ask if there's any questions about this. Yes?
At some point, are you going to talk about the lack of budget lines for this? And
Yes, sure. Yeah. There's actually a box for budget and resources, so we'll get to that. But I want to just say up front, I think that is one of the biggest challenges. You know, we are not magicians. So everything in organizations takes some kind of resources. And so part of my job has always been to advocate for those resources. So figuring out some of this stuff early is really important, because if you can show some early success somewhere, hooking on to something else, you're going to have a better opportunity to leverage for resources. But I'm not going to lie, it's a real challenge. So then the next one is structure. What structure and processes would best support success of a diversity and inclusion program, initiative for your organization? And when I talk about that, I'm not talking about the macro structures in terms of internal alignment. I mean, what is this going to look like? Where is it going to live in your organization? Someone needs to own this. Even if you don't have a chief diversity officer, someone needs to be responsible for this. So how is that going to happen? Is it a someone? Is it a body? Is it a diversity council? Is it a task force? Where is the accountability for this going to lie? And also the authority, because let's be honest, it takes oftentimes authority to get things done in the organization. And I personally have, at Chemonics, I report directly to the CEO. In my previous role, I reported to the head of HR. So I was embedded in HR with a dotted line to our executive vice president. So there's different ways to do this, but it has to live somewhere. And then the dreaded budget and resources. What are you prepared to invest? And that's a really good question to ask your organization. What are you prepared to invest? How meaningful is this for you? Because there's only so much you can do with a wish and a prayer. And that's not to say that in both of my experiences, I started with a very minuscule budget. So you have to start to get creative, I think, in the beginning. And that's why, again, I think going back to being very, very clear about what your initial goals are is very important. There's also some things that you can do that don't actually take a budget. It requires a human resource, right? So the organization might need to allocate a resource to do this or provide some time for individuals to work on this. But some of the things that I did are, let's say, cost neutral. Setting up a diversity council. What does that structure look like? What are the articles of that council? How are we going to operate? What's the nomination process going to look like for that, or the rotation process? What is that work plan going to be for that group? At Chemonics, I'll tell you, this started, I'm going to take a step back from this and maybe share my two examples, because I think they're helpful to show how this can start in two very different ways. When I was at the Inter-American Development Bank, we had a mandate from our board of directors to ensure we had a higher percentage of women in leadership. So we had a direct mandate, and it really started with gender, and then it expanded. So it was really top down, and we needed to figure out how to do this. So some of that how to do this didn't actually require budget in the beginning, because what we had to analyze was, well, why aren't women progressing in the organization? And then we had to work on some of our internal processes. It was actually an and. We had to work on our promotion and our progression, our internal leadership pipeline, but we realized we actually had to do a far better job at attracting women to apply, because we realized in a lot of roles, particularly our senior roles, we were not even getting women to apply. So we had to change the way we were doing things. We already had the HR software in place. We had a lot of the big cost things in place. It was just around re-engineering that process. So it really didn't cost us at that point much money. We made other financial investments later, and the investment was eventually that became a full-time role in the organization. So there was a labor cost to that. At Chemonics, a lot of this started in a very grassroots way. So we had employees who started a diversity and inclusion council. We also started a program called Honoring Our Differences, which was around coming together and celebrating different heritage months, recognizing different identities in the organization. And a lot of this was also very low or cost neutral. What it required, though, was dedication from employees, and it required supervisors to understand that we think this is of a value to the organization. So if someone is going to use their time to do this, we need to allow for that to happen. So in both of these cases, in the way it started, it was it didn't require a lot of costs. Now, we invested in hiring an external consultant to do an organizational assessment. That was before I was hired. That cost money. And then one of the key recommendations of that was, you need someone to lead this. If you're serious about this, you need someone to lead this. And that's where I think the bigger investment came, because I was hired. But I think there are some ways we can get creative to start this, show some success, and leverage that to say, if you want more of this, these are the types of resources I need, and have a budget behind that. Yes?
Something I wanted to add is that many times we have consultants who might miss certain aspects of diversity and inclusion. For example, they might miss people with disabilities. And so then they don't recognize there's going to be a reasonable accommodation cost because they haven't seen that. And then that makes the diversity and inclusion unsuccessful because they haven't budgeted that in. And so we need products and understanding and resources that will help make that happen. It's like, for example, if we're going to hire interpreters to be able to allow a deaf person to work at a company, we need to have people that are actually trained to notice those types of diversity rather than just some of the typical things that have been mentioned in the past.
So I think there's two things here that I'm going to pick up on. First of all, a consultant who you bring in. I think a consultant, you need to look at and evaluate that consultant like you would any other consultant. There's some great consultants. There's some not so great consultants. So hopefully you would have a consultant who understands that if they're conducting a diversity assessment, they need to look at diversity and inclusion very broadly. But there's another piece of that when we talk about budgeting for inclusion, which I think is very, very important. And that was one of the line items when I got my budget that I put in right away, was to make sure that we had money for things like ASL interpretation and other types of accommodations, particularly when we did public events, so that we could walk the talk. It's easy to be inclusive when it doesn't cost you any effort or any money. And I think that is something that is really, really important. And all organizations, by law, should be have an accommodation policy and be already providing reasonable accommodations to their employees in the workplace. But I think that's a really, really good point, is that when you start to think about your budgeting, you need to look at all the different ways of being inclusive for what you want to achieve. So thank you for raising that point. Did I answer your question about budget? Yes? Okay, metrics. How will you demonstrate progress and measure success? And what type of information will you collect? Okay, we all work in organizations that love to measure impact. So we need to do that here too, right? And I think diversity and inclusion is both art and science. So there's some of this that, culture. How do you measure culture? You can do proxy measures through your engagement survey. I guess you can go on Glassdoor and see what people are saying about you. There's some of these things that people say, well, I know it when I feel it. Right? I know because I feel like I belong. I know because I can be myself, my authentic self. Some of these things are harder to measure, but I would challenge you to find a few things that you can measure. On the diversity side, it's easier to measure staff demographics. It's easier to measure some of the talent flows and the talent processes in your organization. You can measure things like internal pay equity. So there's some tangible things you can measure, and some of this where, frankly, you need to get creative to figure out how do I know, not beyond I know when I see it. But my challenge to you is to figure out what data you're already collecting in your organization and what you can use, because in order to get that budget, a lot of times you're going to need to prove that you're moving the needle on something. So what's that something? And then the last piece of this is your other outcomes, right? What financial or non-financial returns do you expect from this? Is it your brand? Is it your reputation? Is it that, we are now known in the industry for being diverse and inclusive, and we are a talent magnet? I often say kind of the combination of these two is, how can you benchmark yourself externally? So one of the speakers this morning talked about the EDGE certification. And so when we were at the IDB, that's one of the things we did, because our first mandate came around gender equality. And so that's where then after some years of working on this, we said, well, we need to be able to benchmark ourselves. We think we're doing pretty good, but how do we compare to other people? And then I was able to leverage that to get the funding to do that external assessment. But not all of them cost money, right? The HRC, the Corporate Equality Index. There's a lot of them out there that are low or no cost to organizations. There's the Disability Equality Index that is now starting to gain some traction. It's been around for a few years. That you can do that. I would even encourage you to do that, even if you don't think you're going to get there. So one of the strategies, again, that I used when I was at the IDB was I did all the application for Working Mother magazine, one of the best places to work for working women. I knew we didn't have all the policy systems and structures in place to win that or to be recognized for that, but I was then able to use that as an external measure and say, here are the areas where we're really lagging. And if we want to be best in class, which is our goal, here are some of the ways we're going to need to invest. So use what you can to think about the returns that you're going to expect from this. And brand and reputation are oftentimes very big drivers for organizations.